Welcome to the On Your Mind podcast, where we believe mental illness can be temporary and transformative. Stay tuned for innovative, effective tools from experts in the field of mental health. Hosted by Timothy J. Hayes, psychologist. This podcast aims to change the narrative around mental illness. Move from a place of fear to a place of hope and solutions. Here on Your Mind.
Dr. Emma Bragdon is the founder and executive director of Integrative Mental Health University, imhu.org. She earned her Ph.D. in transpersonal psychology in 1987 and was licensed in California as a marriage, family, child therapist in 1988. As a pioneer who has helped define the field of spiritual emergency, Emma has published 7 books and co-produced 2 documentary films. Within IMHU, Emma has trained over 130 spiritual emergence coaches who are available to support individuals disoriented or in distress as they open spiritually. She also leads a small group of healthcare providers to Brazil once a year to learn about the Spiritist paradigm of mental health care from Spiritist practitioners. Emma maintains a private practice, consulting internationally via Zoom. Well, Dr. Bragdon, thank you so much for joining us again. It's delightful to see you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. It's an honor to be interviewed by you again.
Thank you. I'll direct people to our first interview for like an intro and an overview of who you are and what you do, and particularly things like Spiritism and mental health, the book that I was reading by you that was just so informative and really opened my eyes to the possibilities that the Spiritism movement might make available to us who have a more limited, you might say, the Western world. Just here's a list of symptoms and here's a list of medications, and you just cross-match them, and then there's your mental health, which is an approach that I've never found works well, but it's the one we're saddled with here in the West.
Yes.
So if you would, give us a little intro overview to what Spiritism is, how it's different than spirituality, and how it opens possibilities for mental health support.
Oh, big question. Okay. So I would say that spirituality, to begin with, is a really large, general, and generous term, having to do with our relationship, if we have one, to the spiritual world. But Spiritism, and a lot of people will want to correct me, like you're really meaning spiritualism, right, Emma? But I'm not. I'm meaning
A different word, right?
Spiritism. It is a different word. So the term Spiritism was coined back in the 1850s, 1860s, when Allan Kardec was writing the foundational books for Spiritism. Now, he was very well known in Paris at the time as someone who was doing adult education, oftentimes, what we would call evening courses and things like that. But he was very exacting as a researcher and as someone who wanted to educate people in a very accurate way. And he was drawn to what was at that time very fashionable in Paris. And what had come to Paris from the United States were seances. So that means people would get together, they put their hands on a table and be somewhat connected, maybe hand to hand or not, but they would be trying to communicate with the spirits. And as Kardec wrote about it, he thought in the beginning, oh, well, this is just fashion and there's not much to it, but I'll go take a look because it's part of what life is like in Paris in the 1850s. So he went, and as a result of his going there, he actually became very interested in channeling, and some of the people who were professed as excellent mediums who could channel information from more intelligent spirits. More intelligent meaning more evolved. In other words, they had inspiring messages for humanity so that humanity could live in a way that was created more happiness and satisfaction. So Kardec was not only just inspired a little bit, he just started giving his life over to interviewing a whole series of mediums. And because he was such a systematic thinker, he thought, okay, so I'll have this list of questions, and I'll give these questions to a bunch of very highly regarded mediums, and then I'll collate the answers so that the answers that are similar that come through, think like 1,000 mediums, the answers that come through that are similar from these highly regarded mediums, I will write as answers to the questions. And I'll also write down who the personage was, in other words, a dead person on the other side, who was professing to give the answers to these questions. Questions like, why are we here on Earth? What's the purpose of this life? What can human beings learn about life on Earth? What happens at death? What's the interaction between spirits and human beings? Is there negative interaction? What's the nature of that interaction? And if we want to have the most positive interaction, how do we do it? So there are lots of questions and answers in his foundational books. And the way Spiritism came to Brazil is that wealthy Brazilians sent their children of university age to the Sorbonne or to Paris to get their university education. And so these young people were aware of what was fashionable and interesting in Paris and brought Kardec's books that were being sold hot off the press, as it were. The Brazilian young people brought them back to Brazil, and it just took infertile ground in Brazil.
Now, that was in the late 1800s?
Correct. We're talking about the
back to Brazil?
1860s, 1870s, and on. So Brazil was fertile ground to take in what was being written about because there was a large slave population that had come over to Brazil that had been integrated into the culture. In other words, there was a lot of intermarriage with the people who were, we can call them Brazilians. We won't just call them white people because there are a lot of indigenous people also that have a spiritualist background. In other words, they believe in the meaningful dialogue between those who were in the spirit realm and those who are in body. So the indigenous people, the people who had come to Brazil through slavery, and the people who had colonized Brazil or grown up in Brazil, there was a great deal of intermarriage and a great deal of foundation for spiritualism, which means this dialogue with the spirits. And so when something came from Paris that was considered very fashionable, and it was very systematic and very clearly cut by this academic, Kardec, it just took. It's like the ground was ready for this. And some very influential doctors, literally licensed MDs, at the end of the 19th century, recognized, oh, this can be a way to complement allopathic medicine, which of course was growing in Brazil, just it was around the world. But we can use some of the formula that are created through Kardec's writings to provide community centers, which will give people insight into the spiritual aspect of why it is they're either psychologically disturbed or physically compromised. And then these a few of these doctors who were influential because they were so highly respected decided to get involved with politics. And so they actually helped to bring Spiritism, in other words, the work of Allan Kardec, into Brazilian culture so that it would be more readily available. especially to people who were looking for help with their psychological or physical functioning. But it was always seen as a complement to allopathic care. In other words, it was not a replacement. It wasn't like the message was not just come to a Spiritist center and everything will be okay and you'll never have any problems again and don't go to a doctor. There was none of that. No anti-psychiatry, no anti-MD. So from that point of view, the Spiritist communities were the first ones that community centers were the first ones that grew up from the writings of Kardec. And what happens in these particular centers is a person can come in and they would speak to someone who is like a social worker and could be a licensed social worker, depends on the center. And the social worker basically interviews the person and finds out what kind of difficulties they're having in their life, either psychological or physical or both. And also finds out, is this a very poor person? Do they need food? Do they need clothing? Are their children getting the adequate care and vaccinations? There would be an interview. And at that interview, the social worker would also say, we recommend that you do X, Y, and Z within our community center. So some of the larger community centers that I visited in Sao Paulo, and we're talking back in the early part of this century, so in the years 2000 to 2010, they actually supplied a food kitchen. They had offered charity, especially to women who might be very young and had no money but had children to take care of. So they offered prenatal care. They offered free clothing. Oftentimes, older people would who were spiritists would get together in the community center and create these lovely packages for young women who were just having their baby who didn't have much support. And of course, that was also good for the older people because they were doing something useful and also had social contact. But they also provided energy medicine in the form of something that we are familiar with through Reiki. In Brazilian Spiritism, they call it a pass, P-A-S-S, or passe in Portuguese. And it's a similar thing to Reiki, and it is hands-on healing in a way, but they don't touch a person. In other words, they're 6 to 8 inches outside of the person's physical body, but it is designed to help a person feel more balanced in their emotional and physical and spiritual life. And it's very popular. People love coming to a Spiritist center to get this free energy work. So there are a lot of free services that are given in the largest centers, including sometimes free dentistry, free medical care. And so Spiritism grew because it was really offering a lot to people who didn't have enough money, but clearly needed help with their physical and mental well-being. Now, as it grew, it also started training people to give the energy work. And it also started training people who had gifts as psychic mediums. So this was considered, not unusual in the Brazilian culture, because if there was already a sense of, yeah, spirits exist, and yes, we interact in meaningful way with spirits, then someone who is a medium who actually can connect with beings who are not in body is not considered abnormal or pathological. But it was then, back over a century ago, and is still now, considered extremely important to give mediums sufficient training so that they can actually be accurate in their work. And their work might be assessing someone to get to the very roots of why it is that they're feeling psychologically imbalanced or why it is that they're having physical issues. So a really well-trained medium who can do this kind of intuitive reading for a person to diagnose them does take a lot of training to be accurate, because a lot of people who are natural mediums are taking in a tremendous number of impressions, and they need to be able to be very, very succinct and accurate in what is coming through if they're really going to be helpful to someone who is looking for a diagnosis and possibly even a treatment plan. So the mediums within the community centers are always in training. They're always under supervision. They will continue to be under supervision for as long as they do mediumship work, and none of them are acting alone. So they always act within groups, and that is to help each other. In other words, literally support each other during these mediumistic meetings, which can be very taxing. But also within the group, there's a sense of, yes, this work is difficult, but we can do it, and we can help each other move into these unusual states of consciousness that are about mediumship, and we can help each other come back from them so we can operate in a very balanced way in our life. One of the things that is a cornerstone for spiritists, and especially those who operate as energy workers or mediums, is ethics. Spiritists are extremely strong about the importance of leading a very ethical life in order to move along in your spiritual evolution. And I would say that was a bit off-putting for me at first when I became involved with studying Spiritism.
What part was off-putting?
The very strong emphasis on ethics.
That was off-putting. Okay.
Well, in the way it came through to me at first. So, if you imagine even in the United States, if we think about Christian churches, there's a very strong ethical component to Christianity, which is wonderful. I'm all for it. But there are some people who might be on a spectrum of extremely rigid and extremely judgmental, and yet they're doing their very best to come from an ethical place. And then there are other people on the spectrum who are very ethical within themselves, but are not as judgmental of other people while standing on a platform of ethics being important. So I happened to meet some people who I felt were excessively judgmental, and I've also met an abundance of people who are spiritists who are extremely ethical and following the principles of Spiritism, but tend not to be as judgmental of other human beings. And so it's a difficult place to stand and to find your way with, to be highly ethical and moral without being excessively judgmental. And of course, we don't want to lose our judgment. So can I bring in the elephant in the room?
Okay. Let's go ahead and do that.
Right. So there are a lot of people who have connected John of God, a healer who is very, very well known internationally. And they've thought, well, he's from Brazil. And so Spiritism is in Brazil. And so he must be a Spiritist. But I've had the opportunity to interview him, to document his work, to be bringing people to get healing from him, and so have had a number of interactions. He has never claimed to be a Spiritist. If he was a Spiritist, first of all, he would have to be studying Allan Kardec's books. And the man is illiterate. He can write his name, but he can't read. So therefore, he cannot study. And study of materials is one of the strong components of Spiritism. It's expected of everyone to study the materials. And that's not to become dogmatic, because the materials are not dogmatic, but it's to provide a way of people really thinking through, why am I here? What is the purpose of my life? What is this interaction with spirits? What is spiritual evolution? So without some of those prompts, people don't usually examine themselves in those ways. So John of God was not able to study. He also put himself out as the medium to go to. So he was not working in a group. He never, in the last 24 or so years, he did not have any supervision because the person he had gone to passed away, Chico Xavier. And so he had no one overlooking him or giving him feedback or helping him if he was having a bad day. That was out. And so that was another thing that is completely against what Spiritists believe is important. He was not getting training. And so not only supervision, but no training, and always working alone. In fact, he was emphatic about he was the medium that people were coming to. So those are just a few things to speak about. And then, of course, as we came to know, he had lost track of his own ethics, if he had them, because he was, I would call him an addict, a sex addict. So he had a real problem and was taking advantage of women and lying to women who were coming to him for healing and basically entrancing them by his power to come into his private offices. And in many cases, they were literally raped. So his ethics was totally out of place. And he was not following Spiritism. So we could call him a spiritualist. Meaning he clearly believed that, yes, there's a meaningful interaction between the spirits and human beings. And he was very facile with being able to connect with beings on the other side who could be a healing force in other people's lives. So he had that as a gift, but unfortunately, he did not have the kind of guardrails that Spiritism provides for people who want to follow the Spiritist way. I'm doing an awful lot of talking here, Tim.
Good, right? This is what we wanted. We
Oh,
had the idea that you were laying out for us the difference between just a spiritual approach to things and the structured guidelines that have been given in Spiritism, which, I think you might have used the term, or my brain filled it in, provide guide rail, right? So the dangerous part of the road, what do? We put guardrails up. Not because
yes,
everybody needs them, but occasionally if something goes wrong, we don't want to go way off the deep end. So
right.
while Spiritism can't tell you exactly this that you need to do, Spiritism provides the guidelines for anybody who wants to use that approach so they stay within acceptable range of behavior and ethics and
Yes.
hopefully with an eye toward marking, watching, accounting for progress. So we're going to do the things that work and we're going to quit doing the things that don't work, right? We're going to be willing to look outside the box if whatever the allopathic medical community has to offer isn't providing sufficient results. We'll look elsewhere because results are probably possible.
Yes. And I would say that has always in my mind been complementary to allopathic care. In other words, it's not just for people who are disaffected by allopathic care, like, hey, this isn't working, I'm going to go down to the Spiritist Center. But it's more like, okay, so allopathic medicine can take me a certain distance, but I need more. And so I'm going to go to a Spiritist Center and get the spiritual perspective on why it is that I'm having these problems.
Okay, and let me ask us to slow down and talk about why I would need more. Well, because the science from other medical doctors who, they had their own physical problems and whatever the allopathic medical field provided for them left them with a brick wall and they couldn't go any further. They went out and looked outside the box and they have said things like, you know what? A healthy, vibrant, thriving human life, flourishing human life isn't rocket science, right? We need clean water and good food and some sleep. We also need a sense of purpose, a connection to community, a sense of love in our lives, an awareness of our connection to other people and things. If it's not just physical, there are these other ways we can connect to people. And allopathic medicine doesn't look at any of that. It doesn't make allopathic medicine bad or wrong. It just means it's too narrow to encompass the whole experience of your humanity. And so when what you're doing isn't working, please feel free to try something else. And Spiritism is one really solid way to supplement whatever your medical doctor might give you for your mental health challenges.
Yes. May I tell a story?
Please do.
Okay. So I have been given permission by this man who is Brazilian to tell his story because I think it's an excellent way of looking into some of the advantages of the Spiritist way of care.
Is this one of the case studies from your book, Spiritism and Mental Health?
I
In your
believe
chapter?
I mentioned it. Yes, you may recognize it as we get into it.
Excellent.
So, Marcelo, when I heard about him, told the story of being approximately 28 years old, and he was still living at home. He was not married, but he had a circle of friends. He lived in Sao Paulo. He had no meaningful trauma to report from his early life, and he was in a job that he liked, and things were kind of rolling along. But he became depressed, kind of spontaneously. No big story around it. And his parents took him to one of the best psychiatrists in Sao Paulo. And the man said, antidepressants, this will help you. So he started taking the antidepressants, but unfortunately, things got worse. Not only was he depressed, but he started having energetic experiences as if things were crawling up and down his arms. And he would literally try to shake them off. So he was irritable because of these odd sensations that were going on in his body, and he could not understand what was happening to him. So his family was Catholic and practiced Catholicism and were very used to that way of thinking. And within Brazil, there are some people who feel like anything to do with spiritualism, including Spiritism, is kind of weird. Just don't go there. So, we find the same in the United States, right? That's nothing odd. But, Marcelo had no kind of way of thinking about these energetic experiences other than to say, "This is weird, and this is abnormal." And then he started hearing voices, sometimes 3 or 4 voices simultaneously within his head that were not coming from any kind of human being outside of himself. And he thought, okay, that's it. I know it. I'm crazy. This is it. And so off he went to the psychiatrist again. And the psychiatrist concurred and said, yeah, this is an example of psychosis. So let's put you in the psych ward and just observe you for a while and see if things get better. And here's an antipsychotic. So he was then taking likely at least 2 pills. In the psych ward, he tended to get even worse, meaning he was losing weight, he wasn't eating, he wasn't sleeping well, and his parents became very alarmed, took him out, and decided to just, be in a very relaxed way, travel around the country, go to the beach, eat out, things like that to relax, but symptoms continued for Marcelo. Well, to make a longer story short, they ended up taking him to a Spiritist psychiatric hospital in a small village called Palmelo in Brazil, which still exists. And within the process of him being admitted to the hospital, he was again interviewed by a social worker. He was given a full medical workup, by an licensed allopathic physician. They discovered nothing wrong with him physically. He had no kind of cultural difficulties, as in racism or poverty or things of that
Early
nature,
childhood trauma kind of thing.
bullying kind of thing, yeah, that might have come from living on the street. And so he was admitted to the hospital, and within the first few days, he was also seen by a person who was a medical intuitive. And this person, who was a highly trained and very gifted medium, could see that Marcelo was actually gifted as someone who could channel higher, more highly evolved beings to benefit himself as well as to benefit other people. But he also was gifted as an energy worker. Now, the medium in this case did not say to Marcelo, hey, this is really what's going on with you. Instead, he started just introducing ideas to Marcelo that would help him move out of his relatively rigid thinking that if he was having unusual energetic experiences or hearing voices, that it had to mean he was crazy.
Right.
So very, very gently, they introduced him to other people who were gifted with the same gifts that Marcelo had, and within the hospital setting, he was eating a really good nutrition and being able to exercise, like play soccer in the fields outside the hospital, and join with others in community. But having access to people who were having the same kind of experiences he had had, but were not considered psychotic, was a big opening. And then he opened up to the notion that perhaps he had some psychic gifts. And within a short period of time, he was trained within the Spiritist Community Center adjacent to the hospital to become a medium and to become an energy worker. And within several months, he was going back into the hospital to offer energy work to the people who were patients in the hospital under supervision. He was not right.
That's right. It's
he
what
had
you said before. The whole thing with Spiritism is there's a structure. There are these guardrails. We have supervision. We don't have cowboys out there, creating their own no holds barred approach.
And we also don't have mediums who are hanging out a shingle and working by themselves.
There's
So
supervision.
yes. So that's an important thing. And one thing that I was totally impressed by when I came to it, and I'm still deeply impressed by, is if you are working as a medium within the structure of Spiritism, you give it all for free. And the notion is it's a God-given gift that you have these particular gifts of in Marcelo's case, for channeling as energy for people, for energy work, but also for channeling beings of a more highly evolved nature. So anyway, it's given for free, which means that
Go ahead.
there's no kind of egotistical notion of, oh, I'm pretty good, so I'm going to charge quite a bit of money for offering someone a reading or channeling from their spirit guide or etc.
And the layers of goodness that come from that are hard to put words on for me. But the idea that, number one, I'm helping a person, which might be me in this case, through a mental health challenge. The next thing is I'm recognizing that there's more going on here than just my physical body and what I might create in terms of a sense of meaning for my life. So if I'm going back into a Spiritist center and donating my time to do energy readings or this medium work, it's because I recognize there's a lot more going on here than what my little 9-bit mind can construct as a sense of meaning in life or a sense of purpose. And this is just a way to participate in that flow, right? I was given this gift, let me give it back. And then the good part about that is it really peels away layers of complexity that come in when we have multiple or dual relationships going, right? It's so difficult to navigate those. They're necessary at some times, especially when people live in smaller communities, right? I mean, like, you can't say, well, I'm not going to go see the therapist because he's my next door neighbor because he's the only therapist in town. But we learn how to, keep things compartmentalized and respect privacy, et cetera, without having the secrecy that has to come when you want to have abuse going, right? How long did the abuse last once it hit the newspaper, once it became a headline? It doesn't last, right? In most cases. Some of the higher ups, some of the bigger trees take a lot more to fall, but it all eventually falls when the light of awareness hits it.
Yes, well put.
All right, so your book, Spiritism and Mental Health, which is quite a gift, it contains, at least in the chapter that you wrote, one of the chapters you wrote was the idea of these case studies, like the one you just gave of Marcelo. And what I want to highlight here is that as I was reading through that chapter in the book, it might have been Marcelo or another person who, after the fact, they returned like back to their life or their home, and they had this therapist and that medical doctor and that physical therapist and that this panoply of people and things helping and supporting. And as I read it, I thought, wow, that's wonderful that this person would have access to all that stuff, and yet most of us don't, right? So, can you address a little bit of how the Spiritism and the things it offers as a kind of opening up the toolkit for how to deal with a mental health challenge, how it can happen even if you can't access 4 or 5 external professionals?
Well, in Marcelo's case, his family did have money, and I'm sure if they had decided to go back into their life in Sao Paulo, they may have accessed some unusual, like, alternative therapists. But when I met them, they were living in, Palmello in a rental. So Marcelo was very happy to be getting the training he was getting in being able to harness his ability to channel, more highly evolved beings, as well as, the training he was getting to do energy work. It was all for free, and he was being held by a community of other people who recognized that he was gifted. Some of them had similar gifts, and so he had peer support in that way, all for free. So he was not being assigned that he should go to various other people, like a psychiatrist or like another teacher or various other people he might need in order to stay balanced, because the community itself was holding him and he was not feeling unbalanced. When I met him, he was on a very, very, very modest, almost subclinical dose of the antipsychotics because he was in the process still of withdrawing. His father was who had been a banker, by the way, was so deeply impressed with what was going on with his son, he decided to take some training as well, all for free. So my guess, and I have quite a bit of background in understanding what's going on within the Spiritist communities. My guess is that they decided to live in Palmello for a period of years so that they could deepen in their training, all for free, and take advantage of the community support. And when they decided to go back to Sao Paulo to be closer to family or closer to old friends, that they also joined a Spiritist community within Sao Paulo, also all for free. And the largest Spiritist centers in Sao Paulo, and I visited them, offer things like community events, art shows, musical events, lectures, energy work, as I've said before. And they also have areas where people are doing charity work. I mentioned before older people coming in and creating layettes for babies and young mothers, or 12-step programs being held within the building, or classes for young children where they said basically be in kindergarten, but be introduced to some of the notions that yes, there is evolution, there is growth. So we're not talking about the same model that we have in the United States, where people go to individual practitioners who may be charging a considerable amount of money in order to stay balanced. We're talking about the balance that can come from being part of a very active community where you participate not only for your own edification and support, but you are also giving back through charity. Maybe you're participating in the free food that's offered or the free clothes or something of that nature. So it's all contributing towards your own spiritual evolution.
Okay, so aside from you,
Yeah.
what signs, what evidence is there that Spiritism is gaining a foothold here in the US?
Oh, in the US. Okay. So
That
there
I
are
I I didn't intend that to be a curveball question.
I was really, really fortunate to be the honored guest of several Spiritist community centers as well as Spiritist psychiatric hospitals, of which there are 50 now in Brazil. But it also allowed me to meet some of the people who were the leaders in the field, as well as people who were researchers and doing a lot of publishing. One of those people is Alexander Moreira Almeida, and he's Brazilian. He teaches in the university in a medical school in Juiz de Fora, but he has also been extremely active on the international stage of bringing spirituality into mental health care. And it's so he has a whole series of videos online. Some of them are in English, some of them are in Portuguese, but he is making a huge amount of effort through his publications as well as videos in order to educate people about spirituality and the importance of spirituality in mental health. He is not just a spokesperson for Spiritism, but he has clearly brought in knowledge of Spiritism. He is a Spiritist, but he's brought in knowledge of Spiritism as just one avenue within bringing spirituality into mental health care. And I was so pleased last year when I heard that he had won a major award from the American Psychiatric Association
Of
for
all
his
places, yeah.
for his contribution to the conversation around religion and spirituality coming into mental health care. So to me, even though he lives in Brazil, works in Brazil, he's well known internationally, and he's had a fabulously important impact in terms of helping people to understand that spirituality can contribute massively to healthcare and especially to mental health.
Well,
So,
and the
and
idea that the idea that excluding it is detrimental to your mental health.
well, thank you. There is that as well, but we don't want to look at the negative side as much as the positive.
Well, but we also, I mean, in that statement that I'm trying to make, and the thought I'm trying to put out there, it's simply acknowledging that every human being has these aspects to their life, whether they choose to develop them, become consciously aware of them or not, they're still there. And so
True.
I don't have to wait until I'm having a mental health crisis to benefit from awareness of what Spiritism offers.
Right on, Tim. I'm totally with you with that. And Spiritism is dedicated to spiritual evolution or development, personal development, or we could say in from another angle to manifesting your full human potential. So that is extremely important.
Yeah.
And I
Who
love the
wants more than that out
vocabulary.
of life? Who wants
I,
more than out of life than to manifest your full human potential? I don't know.
right.
I'm not sure there is any more than that.
Well, I'm with you. I just wanted to put in a word about the program at Harvard on human flourishing because it's alive and well and putting on some really good let's say well I went to a conference that they put on recently and just the program itself and the research that they're doing and publishing about what is it that contributes to human flourishing is an extremely important thread to weave into our conversation because that's my sense is that a mental health care professional needs to be aware of what human flourishing is
Yes,
and help people into that zone and not just say, "Oh, you feel depressed? Well, here's a pill so you won't feel that anymore." That can be extremely helpful for some people for some period of time. So I'm not putting it down as all terrible, but over the long haul, it's not really addressing probably the core issue that's
that's right. It
happening.
doesn't even ask why is that pain here or, why is this struggle happening?
Right. And it also doesn't even touch into what our full human potential is about and how to help someone manifest it.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, I'm thrilled that you're willing to talk about this again. I just want to put a word or two in here about, as a professional in the field, occasionally I run into people that no matter what we do, it's a brick wall. They're not making
Mm,
any progress.
mhm.
And most of the time when that happens, and I'm talking about maybe 3 or 4 people a year in my one caseload, maybe not quite that many. But when it happens, it's so clear to me that something like Spiritism, something like a connection to a higher sense of self or other energies is so necessary, and yet it's almost prohibited in my culture and with my professional licensure. So that's a struggle, and I'm just so grateful to have resources like IMHU, the Integrated Mental Health University.org. Did I get the org right?
Yep, you did.
Okay.
We're a nonprofit.
And the work that you're doing there and the work that you're continuing to do when you travel back to Brazil is just lifts my spirits. I'm just grateful for it.
Oh, thank you so much, Tim. Well, it's really wonderful to have the opportunity to talk about something that I care a lot about and that I feel is also really promising in terms of bringing it to the United States and outside of Brazil. So it's a delight to be able to talk about it with you and have you appreciate it.
Well, I do. I'm grateful for the work you're doing, and I'm looking forward to our next conversation and what it might be about.
Okay.
But thank you so much for taking time. It's been a delight.
Thank you very much. It has been a delight. Until the next time.
Dr. Emma Bragdon is the founder and executive director of Integrative Mental Health University, imhu.org. She earned her Ph.D. in transpersonal psychology in 1987 and was licensed in California as a marriage, family, child therapist in 1988. As a pioneer who has helped define the field of spiritual emergency, Emma has published 7 books and co-produced 2 documentary films. Within IMHU, Emma has trained over 130 spiritual emergence coaches who are available to support individuals disoriented or in distress as they open spiritually. She also leads a small group of healthcare providers to Brazil once a year to learn about the Spiritist paradigm of mental health care from Spiritist practitioners. Emma maintains a private practice, consulting internationally via Zoom.
You've been listening to the On Your Mind podcast, offered by Journey's Dream, where we support people through mental health challenges to a place of true and lasting well-being. If you love our show, we invite you to visit onyourmindpodcast.org to join the conversation, access the show notes, and discover our helpful resources. Thank you for listening.